Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, What You Need to Know to Manage 1099s and W2s in Dynamics GP with MEM. My name is Maria Louie, and I'm on the marketing team here at Binary Stream. Just a couple housekeeping things. We will feel free to type in any questions you have into the little box there on the screen, but we will hold all questions to the end so that Lisa can get through all the content and tackle them at the end. Also, feel free to message your VAR or ask any questions to Lisa. She will put up her email address at the very end of the presentation. Since we're talking about Lisa, I'll introduce Lisa. She's a CPA, CMA, and she's been one for 17 years, so she's a seasoned veteran. She's been a Binary Stream employee for over 8 years, and many of you may know her or spoken to her already. She deals with implementation and training and general accounting, everything for us. So with that said, Lisa, go ahead and let's get this started.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So today we're looking at W2s and 1099s with multi-entity. So let's just take a quick snapshot of what we'll be going through. So I am going to start with the W2s with multi-entity. This will be the smaller part of the webinar. Definitely go through it for all of you who are dealing with payroll with multi-entity. We're then going to go through 1099s in a fair amount of detail with multi-entity. What I will be talking a little bit about are what are the differences between GP and multi-entity so that you can get a good understanding of what changes may have been made if you are new to multi-entity this year. Or if you've been using multi-entity for a while, we'll definitely be going through just what the process is, what are your tools, what are things to know. All right, so if you've been on this webinar before, we've done one every year, this will be a good refresher for you. And of course, as Maria mentioned at the end, we'll be going through a Q&A, so do enter those questions and we'll go through them at the end. And if for any reason I can't enter them or answer them on the spot, we'll definitely be getting back to you and providing those answers. All right, so I'm just going to skip ahead really quickly here. So I wanted to talk about a multi-entity really quick, just some things that have happened to multi-entity in the last year, some new things that are in. So depending on when the last time you've updated or upgraded your system, these are some things that we do have now with latest versions of GP 2016. So all-in-one user views that GP has added, we are supporting with multi-entity with user entity filtering, entity information on those views. Advanced intercompany setup. So this is looking at those intercompany accounts. Whereas before we had a fairly simplistic setup, that's always still available and grandfathered and everybody using that, that still works fine. But for some, we've needed more in-depth intercompany distribution accounts. So different accounts, depending on whether the transaction was originating out of different modules, by trigger accounts, so different accounts needing different intercompanies or different control accounts. So we have different methods now of controlling which intercompany accounts that we use. So that's pretty brand new into multi-entity. We're pretty excited about that. For those of you using master record security, vendors, customers, items, and sites, no longer do you have to go to the entity relation window to assign them when you're setting up a new record, but we actually have the ability to do it right on the card if you're not using things like the class roll down. So if you have to go and individually pick the entities that access that record, you can do it right on the master record now. If you're using payroll, and this will be really important for W2s, we have a new Move Employees utility, which helps if you have an employee moving from one entity to another. So this is an entity transfer wizard. And finally, with centralized AP, those of you using centralized AP out here now, previously with centralized AP, you would do the payment under the parent entity and it would pull in all of the documents from all your child entities. We do have some centralized AP on the fly ability now where you can go and select which entities you want to pay for in this particular payment batch. So those are just some new things added in this year. Again, that's on the latest GP 2016 R2. Those are all available to you now. All right, so let's actually get into the heart of what we're talking about. So just some objectives for the session. If we're talking about W2s, we're looking to understand the impact of payroll home facility, home entity, and that impact on how your W2s report, address setup, printing, where it gets information from the entity. For 1099s, we're going to want to understand the fundamental differences between how GP 1099s and multi-entity 1099s operate. This is especially important for those of you who've just transitioned this year. Understand where to review various 1099 information, and know the tools to troubleshoot your 1099s. All right, so let's get into it. Let's starting off with W2s. And all right. So how are W2s printed in multi-entity? How does it know where to put various employees? So employees in the payroll module with multi-entity, the employee itself is assigned to the entity. And the employee is where we get the information of where to print that W2 information. So depending on which entity that they're assigned to, employees can only be assigned to one entity at a time. And so that is where the W2 information will happen. If you are using payroll home facility functionality, what that does is that allocates expenses only for that employee to another entity. However, it does not split up their liabilities or their W2s. Their W2s, their checks, et cetera, are all going to be coming out of the entity that they're assigned to. Now, from time to time, those of you using our product have employees that will move from one entity to another. So that's where we've built that transfer utility. What that's essentially doing is setting up a new employee record. So even if you have an employee that actually works in two entities at the same time ongoing and needs separate checks, separate W-2s, separate liabilities, then what you're going to be doing is having two employee IDs, one assigned to each entity. The transfer utility will copy a lot of the pertinent information for that employee across, so you don't have to enter it all again. But from the perspective of the system, it is operating two employee IDs. The SSN number is what ties it together. And there are some products out there such as Green Shades and others that print W2s. They know what we're doing. They do work with us on that in terms of knowing how to print the W2s. And also that will come through if you're printing W2s natively out of GP itself. All right. So that's really the core of how it knows where the employees go, where it determines what entity to print it out of. Again, just big note with the payroll home entity that is allocating expenses only to other entities. So printing of W2s, important things to note on the print W2 forms window in GP. This is the multi-entity version. So they are printed a single entity at a time. So you will be entering which entity that you're printing for. In this case, it says facility ID, but that could be entity or company, whatever you've labeled your label in your system, that's what will reflect there. So this would be printing for entity 100 in this case, in my example. The other thing that'll be important is the address ID. So address IDs with payroll are assigned to the various entities, and so that will be tell you what address IDs are accessible. So if I'm printing for entity 100, the only addresses I can pick in here to print my address or the company's address will be the address ID that is assigned to company 100. The other important piece to note is the employer identification number. That will be coming from your tax ID setup, and that one is assigned specifically by entity. So as you change the entity ID in here from 100 to 200, the address ID filtering happens, and the employer identification number will update appropriately based on your setup. So just again, with the payroll home entity, I just wanted to kind of hammer this point home a little bit. So this is the ability to go to various payroll transactions and say, okay, my employee, John Smith, belongs to entity 100. And normally everything gets paid out of entity 100, but they worked 4 hours for entity 200. So I can go into the employee transaction and I can make an entry for those 4 hours saying this 4 hours, and it is assigned to entity 200. This is only if this functionality is enabled in your setup. Then when we go to generate the payroll checks, the 4 hours of expenses in relation to the salary expenses and the benefits expense and things like that are all split out and calculated for 4 hours. And those expense accounts are coded to entity 200. However, all the liabilities, the checks, et cetera, are all paid out of entity 100 where John Smith really resides. And the W-2 will only be printed out of entity 100, so for the whole amount that they worked. So that is really where, if they are consistently working in 2 entities, each entity has to issue a W-2 for that particular employee, then really you are looking at 2 employee records. And again, we do have that utility to help you create the second record quite easily. Now, if you are dealing with W-2s and printing them out, mailing them out, you might be looking for some method of helping you with that. So there are various products out there, such as I mentioned before, Green Shades is one that I know of, and there's a few others that help you deal with your W-2s and print them out if you're not doing them standard in GP. However, if you are doing them in GP itself and you don't have those other products and you don't want to have go to those others necessarily, is we also have, just to mention, an emailer product, which called Emailer, which will help mass email your W-2s. So this allows for the automatic transition of the W-2s. Also, if you do direct deposit, the direct deposit slips can be generated through those. And then also it supports automatic attachments as well. Just wanted to bring that up in case that's something you're struggling with, that there are some options out there that you can talk to us about. So for W-2s, as I mentioned, that's going to be a little bit of the shorter part. It's pretty straightforward. Certainly if there's any questions, we'll be looking at those at the end. So definitely put your questions in right now and we can get to those and I can answer them or follow them up for you. All right. All right, so now we're going to kind of move over into the 1099 area, which is a little bit bigger and a little bit has a few more nuances with multi-entity. All right, so first thing I want to talk about is how GP works with multi-entity, or sorry, how GP works with 1099s. And then we're going to talk about the differences with multi-entity. Now, again, if you've been using multi-entity for a while, this is probably not going to impact you too much, but certainly if there are any people that have implemented this year or partway through the year, or if there are any of our partner consultants out there that are helping people implement or helping you deal with, why are these numbers not coming up right? And this is just something to look at. It's also changed if you've been using GP and now using MEM, what you're going to see is some differences in on the screens. So first of all, the way that GP deals with 1099 information is that as transactions are flowing through your payables or your purchasing, as those amounts are applied either through they've been paid or they've been credited or whatever other method that an amount has actually been applied to. So not an open payable, but a completed payable. If the vendor is a 1099 vendor, and on the transaction that 1099 information carries through and is captured that this transaction is has to be dealt with or calculated into the 1099, then what GP does is takes that amount from the transaction and adds it to a total that it stores for that vendor. It says this is the 1099 amount for this vendor, for this tax type, for this box number. And it continues to keep adding those amounts as the payments are made. All right, so that's stored in what we lovingly refer to as the 1099 summary table. All right, so that number just keeps getting added to and subtracted to depending on what's happening in the system by GP, and it calculates and stores the information. Now, if you are making any adjustments to the 1099, usually before you do your reporting, if you're using GP, you go into the 1099 details, and we'll see all of this a little bit later on, and you'll say, this is what the 1099 amount should be. Maybe a transaction was missed, maybe the vendor wasn't marked early enough, what have you. And you'll basically enter over what the corrected 1099 amount is. That number is then stored, overwrites the number in the summary table and is stored. Excuse me. And then that is what will report on your 1099s. All right, and then whatever number you enter, if there's further transactions, it adds and subtracts to the total that's in there. So with multi-entity, we had to do something a little bit different because we need to be able to know every amount and which entity it's belonging to and how it's getting stored. So similar idea. We look at those transaction tables and, you know, when the payables have been paid, so that's saying, yes, this is now a 1099 amount. We actually, whenever you look at a 1099 total through multi-entity, it is always calculated on the spot based on the latest information from the transaction table. We are not storing a 1099 amount. Now, if for whatever reason you're looking at your numbers, you need to make an adjustment to that 1099 table, instead of just saying this is the new total for 1099, we ask you what is the adjustment amount. So if it's reporting right now that I have $5,000 in my 1099 for this vendor in that box number, and it should be $5,250, what you're going to enter is a difference of $250 as an adjustment. We will add that to the calculated 1099 amount, and we'll report the $5,250. But what you will always have a traceability amount is how much is the system actually calculating, and how much is related to just your adjustment. So the reason why we don't have you override the 1099 amount is so that we have traceability back to where it's coming from. We also never look at that 1099 summary table from GP. And this is, once you have moved to MEM and you're using our Windows or using multi-entity, that's not going to be a big deal because we update that summary table just so that if you ever need to, the information's there with any of our adjustments, but we do not actually go to that table and pull information. We don't look at the total in there. And the reason for that is that because it can be overridden, we have no idea which entity that number belongs to. So we need to be able to be smarter about it and split it up. So if you have, so with 1099s, there's just some things to be aware of. So first of all, with multi-entity, you're probably used to using our version of some of the GP windows. If you've been using multi-entity for a while and have never used it or used GP without multi-entity, you may not know the difference. But I'm just going to kind of go through a few things to be aware of. So first of all is Windows security. Just because we have a mixture of consultants and end users on, so consultants is more for you, or system administrators is more for you. If you're the end payable person, don't worry, we'll get to some interesting stuff for you in a minute. All right. So first of all, do you want to print 1099s by entity? Generally, yes. Depending on what you're using multi-entity for. Not all of our users are using it for true separate entities. Some people use it more for departmental type work or division type work, but are still reporting globally. So that's the first question to ask yourself. So we can set security appropriately. If we're not using 1099s, if we're just going to report globally, then what we can use is we can use the native GP functionality. So the summary table, just have it print one total for the vendor. But in the majority of our multi-entity users, that's not the case. So we want to make sure that we are using the right multi-entity alternate windows. So there's several to be aware of. There is a 1099 details window. So that's the one where you go in to make adjustments. There is the 1099 details inquiry window, which users, if they're not allowed to make adjustments, but they want to see the totals, need to go in there to see. There's a payables management setup window, and now that's actually the 1099 limits window. We do have an alternate window for that. What I will tell you is that if that is turned on, you probably don't want it on. I've mentioned that it's optional, but for the large majority of the users, they do not need to be using the multi-entity window there. All right. So that's something you can check, and I'll show you how to check it in a sec to see which version you're looking at. And I'll talk about why we don't necessarily want to use it. The print 1099 window. Obviously, this is the version we want to make sure we're seeing. We're seeing that we can select from different entities on it. That's obviously if we want to print by entity at all, we need to be using that alternate version. As well, on the reports side itself, the actual 1099 reports that are generated out of the system, do make sure that there is the alternates turned on for the reports as well as the windows. Okay, so that's just some housekeeping, some administrative stuff. Again, if you've been using multi-entity for a while, this has already been done for you. If you've already reported 1099s previously out of it, it should be set correctly. All right, so the next setup window I want to talk about is the 1099 setup window. This is under your payables management setup. Okay, now how you know whether you're using our alternate window or not is if you go in there and you see the facility or the entity ID at the top of the window. If you don't see it, that means you are using the GP standard window, and for the large majority of the users, that's really what you want to do. Our alternate window, what it allows you to do is to set different minimums per entity for the different boxes. Now, I do have a note in here, once used, cannot use the GP window. What that means is that it's when we run our print 1099s, if there is data that's been entered by entity, it checks that first. And then if nothing exists there, then it goes to the GP totals that you would see in the GP standard window. So there's a way to correct that. If you've done that by accident or whatever, not a problem. Talk to us, talk to our support. We can help you with that. Not a big deal. So get that corrected. I think I've been educating on 1099s or multi-entity for a number of years, and I've stressed that with a lot of people. So I think we're pretty good out there, but I always just like to mention it. Just go have a check and look at that window and see what version you're looking at. We do have a couple users that needed that and for what they were doing, and so we have built that. But typical use, leave it on the standard GP window. All right. Next parts of 1099 setup, I mean, really this is whether using GP or MEM, it's pretty much the same. So just as a revision, the vendor maintenance options, obviously in order to report 1099s for a vendor, they do need to be turned on as a 1099 vendor and have a tax type and then the default 1099 box. That is stuff that can be changed. I know that GP gives you tools now to update if you didn't have them turned on initially, and a way to recapture some of the earlier 1099 amounts that might have been missed. So that's all good. That still is true with multi-entity. If you have vendor or entities that are sharing the vendor, it's a single vendor record, so it is a 1099 vendor in both entities, and if both entities have payable amounts or 1099 amounts, then those will be reported, but they'll be reported separately by entity. Next, we want to just talk about a couple things on the multi-entity setup. So one of the big things to be aware of is, and this is for users of our centralized AP only. So one of the things to make note of, if you're decentralized, what that means is I create check batches for every entity that I have. you don't need to worry about this. Because if I'm decentralized, you'll be entering payable transactions and then payments out of the same entity, out of the checkbook for that entity. So the payment, the original transaction and the payment transactions both belong to the same entity. There's no question where that 1099 gets reported. All right, it's going to be out of that whatever entity it's for. If we're using centralized AP, what that means for us is specifically our centralized is when we do centralized select checks. So what that means is we have a setup that says I have an entity that's responsible for paying my payables. And I have child entities who that entity pays on behalf of. So I'm going to create one check for a vendor, and it may pay for the payables of several different entities. So the transactions, the original payable transactions are entered under these different entities, and then the payment comes out of the parent entity. Now, by default, when we're reporting 1099s, we say, well, then the 1099 goes out of the entity that paid. Per se. So that would be your default if nothing else is marked. We will report it out of the parent. So if I'm entity 100 and I pay on behalf of entities 200 and 300, my 1099 is coming out of entity 100. Now, we have a number of users that come to us and they have that set up, but they say, no, we need the 1099s reported separately. So if I enter the transaction under entity 200 and entity 300 and entity 400, that's where I need my 1099 reported out of. And so yes, we have a switch in the setup that says print 1099 by child. All right, so if that is turned on, again, if you're decentralized, no impact. If you're centralized, what that does is it changes our calculations. Now, remember I said we calculate the 1099s on the fly. So what that means is as soon as that switch is changed, the nice thing about it is you don't have to worry about if you had the switch wrong, because as soon as you change the switch, we redo our calculations. So anything that was in there before, we'll fix it. All right, so you don't have to really worry too much about that. Some of the other things to note about doing 1099s in terms of the MEM setup is tax registration numbers and address and company names. Now, this is going to be a little bit different depending on what version of multi-entity you're using. We've made some changes. So some of the looks in 2016 are different if you're working in 2015 or earlier. The windows are different. So what we did is we took a bunch of our setup windows and kind of amalgamated them into one entity setup. So if you're on 2016 later, you'll have an entity setup window. And on there, we'll specify the entity. We'll have a field for the legal name of the company. That will be used to print on the 1099s for that entity. Also, we have a default address ID. That address ID is what, again, we will print on the 1099 for that entity. And then finally, we have the entity ID tax registration number over on the right-hand side. I think the format's a little funky, but because I typed it in. But regardless, whatever you put in that field is the tax registration number that we will print on the 1099. Now, if you're on an older, slightly older version of multi-entity, you won't have that window. You'll have an earlier version of that window called the default address setup. All right, so you will have the entity ID on there. You'll have a field called the 1099 address ID. That's what we called it before, but it's the same field. The other thing to note is we don't have a legal name field on here. So in earlier versions, the company name by default that we pull is your segment description for the entity. So for entity 100 under your segment setup, your description name was our company name or entity name, and that's what we printed. What we were finding though is that that had a limited number of characters. We had some people with some longer legal names. So what we've done is we've given you a legal name description. Now, if you are converting from one of these earlier versions to a later version, not a problem. Whatever you had set up before in the description will default initially to the legal name field. So we take care of that conversion, no problem, whatever you have. But for those of you that were dealing with longer names and we were using fields off the address line, you don't necessarily have to do that anymore, but whatever you did before will still work fine. All right, so we made sure that that's all covered as you convert up. The one thing you're not seeing on this older window is the tax registration number. So under our older versions, that was held under a separate window, and we just kind of gave you the list of your entities and your federal ID numbers, obviously with very fake registration numbers over here, but essentially the idea was that that's where you put your different registration numbers. Whatever you put in there, we pick up on the printing of the 1099s. All right, so let's move into actually seeing the 1099 amounts. So again, 1099 amounts are going to be calculated based on those transactions. Again, if you're decentralized, whatever the entity on the payable transaction and actually the entity that's paying for it, which would be the same, that's where your 1099 amount will show. So if you look over here, this is a alternate version of the 1099 details window. It might be a little small for some of you, but you can see here the entity 200, and we'll see that the 1099 amount is coming across. If you are using centralized AP, all right, so in this case, this document for entity 200 is getting paid out of 100. So if we leave it at default, then the 1099 amount will show up when it's under 100. If we're print 1099 by child, it'll show up under 200. I'm going to take you into the system and just kind of show it to you on the fly so that you can have a really good look at that. All right. So right now, if we go to my multi-entity setup, all right, and we go to the purchasing tab, this is where you're going to find that. So right now, it says print 1099 by child. I'm actually going to take that off for a second. All right. And then I'm going to go over to payables and my cards and my 1099 details. Now, in my particular environment, entity 100 is my parent entity. So they're the ones doing all the payments. So I have a vendor, Allison. All right. So I want you to make note of where the 1099 is showing. So we're seeing 1725 down under box 7. All right, as my 1099 amount. Now, if I go back to my setup, and what happened is that 1725 is made up of a number of different documents, some that were entity 100, some of them were entity 200, 300, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on. Now, just make a note, obviously, this is not something you're flipping back and forth. I'm just doing this for example purposes. Once you have determined your methodology, then, or where that 1099 needs to report of, you're going to set it and forget it. But just in case it's showing up in the wrong place right now, you go to you check your 1099 totals, you're like, why is it all showing under here? Or why is it all separated? It should be here. This is where you can check. Okay, so I've selected entity 100. You'll notice my total has gone from 1725 to 450. If I look under entity 200, we can see here's another part of the amount. Under 200, if I went to 300, another portion would be there. So that's just an example of how this calculated amount is showing up on the fly based on that switch. So if it's set wrong, you don't have to worry about doing any adjustments per se. Change the switch, we recalculate it for you. Now, the other thing to note about this window, beyond that the entity ID is on there, is that the look of the 1099 window is a little bit different. So if I go back to my slides here, I'm just going to bring that up and let's do that. And yeah, there we go. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit to bring it up. So the biggest difference here, if you have used the GP 1099 details window before, there's just one column of numbers in the window. It just says, here's the 1099 amount. It shows you what it's come up with, and then you just overwrite it. You can see here we have the separated adjustments column. So this calculated amount is non-editable by you. That is what we are calculating. So you can't make any changes to that number, but what you can do is make an adjustment here, and then that will add together to come up with the total 1099 amount, and that is what we will do. Now just make one thing to note, this adjustment column, wherever you put it, whichever entity you enter it under, it's stored with that entity. So this is not impacted by that print 1099 by child. So do make sure that you've made that determination first before you put any adjustments in. We won't move the adjustments for you. You have to move them yourself. Okay. Now, inquiries, I just kind of want to touch on these. Vendor yearly or period summary is not displayed by entity. So the amounts that you'll see in there when you go into those inquiries are the total. If you make any adjustments to any particular entity, the totals will be updated, but it is a total for the vendor. It's not a total by entity. If you want to see the 1099 details by entity, again, if you look at the 1099 details inquiry, which is essentially just an inquiry version of this window, so obviously whoever can make adjustments you limit access to, but if you're a user that doesn't have access to make adjustments, you just want to see the totals. If you see the inquiry window, it looks like this, and you can see any adjustments made and the calculated totals. Now, I just want to move back one screen. Sorry to go back and forth a little bit on you. I just wanted to talk about the edit 1099 transaction information. So the vendor IDs in here, this is where if the vendor was not turned on to 1099 early enough or initially, and it is, or you need to make an adjustment of whatever, you can go into this window, and basically this helps with historical transactions, making sure that the 1099 amounts do report correctly. So I just wanted to make note on this window that the vendor ID is filtered. So if you're using vendor security, whether a user can access the vendor based on their entity access is filtered. However, the transactions, this will still show all of the transactions for that particular vendor across all entities that it is being used for. So again, you might want to make sure that the user that makes changes in here or who has access to this edit transaction window, information window, is someone who is allowed to see and make changes to anything under that particular vendor, right? Moving on, so when it comes to the end of the year, beyond looking at just the 1099 details inquiry, if you want to start with maybe a more summary level, we do have a 1099 smart list, if you're not aware of, which will take the vendor, it'll list the entity ID, and then the year. Now, by default, our smart list just shows you all years. Now, if you've been using it for a number of years, obviously you don't want to see all the past years. So throw a quick filter on your smart list for the year you're working on, so that it filters down to the correct year for you. So I've done for the screenshot, I threw in a filter for 2017, so it can just show me that. All right. So then it's going to show you by entity the calculated 1099 amount, the adjustments, and your 1099 total. And again, this is impacted just as much by that 1099 by child. So if you make that change, it'll differentiate where it shows on the smart list, because we're always recalculating on the fly whenever we look at this. Again, adjustments don't get moved. Okay. Now, if so that is where you can start to validate your 1099 information, rather than kind of going through the details inquiry or having to go and print that edit list in the print 1099s. You can start here without maybe creating a whole lot of paper. You can throw this in Excel and use that for your review. Now, there are some limitations. It's not showing you the box number or anything like that. In order for that information, you'd have to kind of go more deeply into the vendor, but it is a starting place for your totals, for your review. So let's move on to the actual printing of the 1099s. All right, so if you go to the print 1099 window, this is an alternate view of the window. So just back at the beginning when I was talking about security, I mentioned that some of our users use multi-entity for not necessarily separate legal entities. So they may be still trying to create a consolidated print 1099. If that's the case, you do not need to use our alternate views. You can just use the GP for these specific 1099 windows. Talk to us a little bit more about that if that's you, and we can help you with that. But for the majority of our users, we are going to have some sort of separation into different entities. So what you're going to do is we have a list of entities that you can select to print. And you can see you have a multiple selection option here, and that we can select them all and print them. So whether you're doing the edit list or actually printing, they will, you can do it all in one go. So just some reminders of what shows up on that 1099 and where it's getting that information from. So the company name for the entity will, if you're using our newer version, that will come from the entity legal name on the entity setup. If you're using an older version, by default, that is coming from the segment description of the entity. So what's showing in this column right here. For some of you that maybe had longer legal names, and I bet you've been had talked to our support about it, we probably did did some modifications of the report or worked with your VAR to modify the report a little bit, pull an address line or something like that, just to give you a longer field name. Don't need to do that anymore. Legal name is quite long. Okay, the federal ID number, which will be showing here, that is going to come from the entity setup or from the old tax registration number window. And the address ID on here will come from the entity setup as well, from the default entity address, or again, on the older versions, it would be specifically the 1099 address field. Now, if for any reason you did not put in an address ID for an entity, so we often may have that you're dealing with multiple legal entities, but you're kind of running them out of the same administration office, and they're going to all have the same address ID. So a couple options on here for that. I mean, you could set up a single address ID and then assign it to every entity, and so we'll pick that up. If there is no address ID on the entity setup or the default address setup, that field is blank, then we actually go back to the address ID that's on the print 1099 window, which defaults from your GP company setup. So if you're all coming out of the same office, you don't need to set up the address IDs for the different entities. You could just leave them blank and then have it pull from the GP company setup here. Okay, so that's sort of our, if it's not there, then we go here. All right, the other thing that happens when we print 1099 by entity. So I'm just going to go back to that 1099 minimum amounts window. So say for box 7, I think the minimum amount, and I don't know if it's changed, I think it was 600 at one point. So I talked about the different versions using just the GP setup where we just set up that limit minimum amount. We apply that minimum amount against each entity as we're printing it. So even if we're printing it globally, so we'll come up with the entity 100 for vendor A, and we'll check that against the minimum amount. And if it's greater than, we print it. If it's less than, we don't print it. Then we go to 200, we check that same amount against that minimum amount, we print it or don't print it. So that global minimum amount is getting checked against every entity that we print. If we've set it up by entity, that each entity matches up each entity and checks. If there's nothing set up for the entity, it goes to the GP global setup. All right. Now, you'll see when I hit up here, instead of just hitting print, there's some options showing. So let's talk a little bit about that. There is a consolidation feature. So what often can happen as well, so these are some nuances to the 1099, is that we might have multiple entities, and I'm saying entities in quotes, but really some of our entities are related and need to be reported together for 1099 purposes. So for example, if we said that in this view, entities 000 through 200 are to be reported consolidated, then we can give you that option. So basically it does it on the fly. When you're printing consolidated, you do not mark all because it will consolidate all. What we want to do is we will have to run the different consolidations separately because we need to just work with each group. So if, say, the first three were my consolidated, I would just mark these three and print consolidated. So then what it does is it goes through, finds the vendor, goes through those three entities, adds those three entities together to come up with the 1099 amount that is compared against the minimum, and then determine whether it prints or not. Now with that, some of the stuff I said about the setup goes away. The reason for that is when we have three different entities, how do we know which one has the correct ID number and address and name? The truth is we don't. So we will, when you are printing consolidated, we go back to what is displaying on this window. So there is a company name at the top that's going to default from the GP company setup. Make sure that that reflects the consolidated company name that you want printed. The address ID, select the address ID for the consolidated company. And then the federal ID number down here, you'll need to put that in. So we will not store for consolidations that information. I mean, you have this set up, but if you put it in, we ignore it when we print. So that's only if you're like combining them together. If you're printing them individually, we pick it up for you. All right. There is also a sort order option available that we've added, which is by entity, by state, or state entity. So that's just the order in which the 1099s will come out of. I believe for by state entity, there is in addition to the alternate report, we actually have a modified report you would need to get from us. It's available on the portal, downloaded, that you just need to use instead in order to use that sort order. One other piece about, so that's the printing of the 1099s. Now, one other piece I just want to bring up, and this is more for troubleshooting 1099s. This is more for people that may have migrated during the year and are using multi-entity over a, they started it off over a pre-existing GP company. In fact, they were already using the 1099 GP company and then worked with multi-entity. People have done different things when they start out. Sometimes they start with just a fresh database, bring all their entities in. Now, if you already have a pre-existing multi-entity data or GP database that you install multi-entity over and start using, there is information in there for the company that was already previously going in that. And so you might have had someone go into the 1099 details and make adjustments, etc. So if you remember back at the beginning, I said if you had made something on the GP version of the details window, we don't pick it up because GP is storing a summary amount that we don't look at. We update it, but we don't use it for our calculations. So this is just under our utilities, under multi-entity, is the 1099 calculate compare process. This is more, again, it's going to be getting into your administrators and managers and your consultants to help just look for differences. So what this utility does is it brings some of that information to light. So we will look at the totals that if we look we're to calculate for a particular vendor all of the entities together, what would display under MEM. Here's our MEM total. We look at what the GP summary table says. Theoretically, those should be the same. So we would do all that. We look at any MEM adjustments as well. So we break it all out. This screenshot doesn't show the complete number of columns in here. But really what we're looking at towards the end is is there a difference between MEM and GP? And then do we want to synchronize? So there is this is a utility because we can synchronize it. What we would do with the synchronization though is we would write the multi-entity total back to the GP summary table. So the thing to note about that is if there's something an adjustment that got made on the GP version of the window that we need to capture multi-entity, we need to enter it as an adjustment under the appropriate entity, and then we'll get it picked up in here, and then we might want to synchronize it back so that this difference is 0. I made sure that you could see a difference there. So this is really just a troubleshooting utility to help you identify. The other thing that might have happened is if you had some transactions that, you know, from time to time, or people starting up, they didn't assign some of their transactions to an entity, so they're kind of invisible. This helps highlight, oh, there might be something we need to go and have a look at here. And that's a different thing in that you'd have to go and make sure all transactions, there's nothing in your assign entity utility. So this could also highlight some of that as well. So that's just the utility to help you with that. Again, if you have any questions about where we're pulling the numbers and how to synchronize it, definitely talk to us, talk to our support, talk to me, and we can help you walk you through that. All right, so because I've been doing this webinar for a few years, what I like to do is just go through some of the previous questions that we've had, just in case these happen to be questions you had as well, because I always find it valuable to bring that forward. We get, again, some of these are probably a little bit more administrative layering, high level, but just so that you know. So we got asked what happens if you run check links and run reconcile if you make adjustments. So just be aware that this does not update our 1099 adjustment table. It will work to reconcile the GP transaction tables. And since we calculate our 1099s off of the transaction tables, whatever you reconcile or adjust will get picked up. So all of that would get captured. Our adjustments, though, will not, I mean, there will be no change to the adjustments that are in our adjustment table. Okay. So I get asked if there's anything new in green shades because they do work with us and to print 1099s and W2s. Just so you know, we're unaware of any changes. There wasn't a lot of changes, I know, on our side for 1099s this year. Usually we have something we have to do for the year-end update, but we didn't have to this year, so which was really cool. So green shades not let us know if there is any changes on their side. So if you are using that, shouldn't have any differences or things that you need to deal with there. Another question we've gotten is there any way to run a report that will include the amount paid year to date by vendor in the 1099 total? This would allow us to easily capture vendors we missed, turning on the 1099 type. So by default, no, we don't have a report that does that. For the most part, any reports we have are just alternates of GP reports. I don't think GP had a report that did that. So there's not an out-of-the-box report. However, we did also have a discussion at that point that, you know, a smart list can do this, and if you can build smart lists to kind of capture that and help you troubleshoot that. And then we have the entity filter that can be added to any smart list so that you can kind of get it down to the smart list level. All right. Next one was GP has a professional tool to update 1099 amounts for vendors. If you forget to mark them, does this tool work with binary stream? So per GP, the description of the tool is the 1099 modifier report will reconcile these amounts into the summary tables. So they print on the 1099 reports. This is actually pretty important. So, excuse me, because it updates that summary, we will not pick up those changes. So what we want to look at is that 1099 edit a transaction information window that GP provides that allows you to go through and have the transaction itself now report as a 1099. That will get picked up by us, but this particular tool, 1099 modifier tool, we will not, because it's not updating the transaction, it's updating the summary only. All right, so those are some of our frequently asked questions. Now, before we get on to the questions, I just wanted to mention, so some of you might be using multi-entity for a while, but still maintaining some other company databases outside of your consolidated database, either for functional currency reasons, fiscal year ends, chart of accounts, or inventory. I just wanted to mention that we do have what's known as the intercompany bridge, which works with multi-entity, that will help aid in the intercompany between those other remaining databases back and forth into an environment with multi-entity. So if you've been struggling with that, again, talk to us about that, because we've got some really cool tools on there. We've added some master record. Actually, let me bring it up so you can see it. We have some master record synchronization across databases now, some centralized reporting, ability to use some centralized inquiries, the intercompany transactions, transferring inventory. It's not as slick as MEM, I gotta be honest. If you can use MEM, it's awesome, and be in one database because you're just so much more efficient. But there are reasons why it's not appropriate for everybody, or they're using MEM and you also have, still have these other databases that you got to deal with. So it's something to check out if that's something you're struggling a little bit with. But I just wanted to bring that up because not everybody's aware that we have that. All right, so let's get back to the 1099s and the W2s. So any questions and answers, and just give me a minute so I can see here.
I've got them. So Jeff Lewis, he asked, I want to confirm my understanding on the print 1099 by child checkbox within the MEM setup. Our company uses centralized AP, and we would like to process our 1099s in a centralized fashion. We should uncheck the print 1099 by child box, correct?
Absolutely correct. So when it is by default, without anything checked on the setup, we will report the 1099 out of the entity that paid the check. So if 100 is paying for 200, 300, 400, the 1099 will print under 100 without anything marked.
Okay, next question is Amber Schmoll, and she asked, do you know the IRS rules on who has to submit the 1099? The company who cuts the AP check or the company the expense was coded to when using MEM?
That I am not an IRS expert, and I will hesitate to give any advice on that. I would say check with your audit team on that, or check directly with the IRS on how to do that. We've given you the tools to which way to go on printing them, but we don't give advice as to where that needs to be printed from ourselves.
Oh, okay, great. Moving on. Lisa Collins asked, if we have centralized and decentralized direct payments from the child company, will this activity roll up into one 1099 for the vendor?
All right, so if they're making payments out of the child entity, as well as having some of the payments be paid for by a parent entity, so it really depends on where the transaction is assigned, the payable transaction, and if print 1099 by child is marked on their setup. If print 1099 is marked on their setup and the payable itself, whether it's paid for out of another entity or paid for out of that entity itself, the 1099 total will include everything. If they don't have print 1099 by child, anything that's paid for by that other entity will report out of the parent entity, and then the things that are paid directly by the child entity will get reported under the child entity. One of the distinctions I want to make, and just be very, very clear about this, is that when we're saying that it is entered under the child entity, we are looking at the payable transaction entry window specifically, or purchasing, and what entity is showing up here. So if this is 200 and it gets paid by 100, and print 1099 by child is on, then it will report under 200. If it's also paid under 200, then it's reported under 200. If print 1099 by child is not marked, then this is paid by 100, it gets reported at a 100. If it's paid out of 200, it's still getting reported under 200 because that's who paid for it. But what I want to be specific about here is that if I have a payable that I've gone in and all I've done is split up some of the purchase amount. So if I said some of this was split between 100 and 200, we do not take into account that purchase split. You would have to look at that yourself and the 1099 reporting. For that, we allocate the expense only. The 1099 amount remains whole and is printed with the transaction. So you need to look at where the transaction is assigned as to where it will report for 1099 purposes.
So for the next question we have, does the 1099 Smart List exclude voids?
So the 1099 Smart List, I believe that when you void a transaction in GP, so if you avoid the payment, then the void should not be included in the calculation for the 1099, which would happen when native GP or us. We follow, to that extent, we follow GP, whatever they do in terms of whether they include it or don't include it. So if you void a payment, then I believe it would not be included in the calculation. And I can verify that, but I'm 99% sure that's true.
Okay, so for the next one, Stephanie Rother posted, maybe I missed it. You mentioned we shouldn't use the payables management setup window. Why is that?
Sure. So the payables management, so I'll just bring up the window so we can see it here in front of us. And it's down here when you go to the 1099 setup window. So I actually have my alternate window turned on right now. The reason why I said don't use it is that it's fine, you can. It just means that this isn't actually set up correctly, but if we had our minimum amounts, we would have to go through every entity and set that in order for that minimum amount to apply. So if we just use the standard GP window, then we only have the tax type and the box number to worry about in terms of having the minimum amounts in there. And then those minimum amounts will apply to each entity separately on its own without us having to do this setup by entity. It's just an additional administrative piece that you would have to manage. And I've found over my years of supporting users, they don't need to do it. It's just an additional step. So we did have a client that was using it, and obviously that's why we built it. But for the most part, the large majority of users, we don't need to do it, because if the government goes and changes that minimum amount, instead of just coming in here and doing it for the box, we need to go through every entity and box number combination to update that amount. So you can see where sort of the maintenance of it can get to be a bit onerous. And I mean, it's fine if you've only got 2 or 3 entities, but we've got people using 70, 100 entities in the database. So, you know, the update would take a while.
From Marla, is GP used to submit the 1099 and 1096 forms electronically to the IRS?
So that one I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to go double check. I don't believe GP has that native functionality to submit. So our 1099 submission is based specifically on whatever GP has, and then we just separate it by entity. I don't believe they have the electronic submission in here unless they've changed something that I'm unaware, but I haven't heard of that. From what I understand is we print the forms here, and then those would have to be submitted. So I don't believe there's an electronic transmission here. That's why a lot of people have gone to using other products that I mentioned earlier that have that capability, I believe.
Melissa, I think I'm reading this properly, but print 1099 consolidated with multiple vendors if paid under $600 in one of the other entities.
Okay, so what happens in this print 1099 window? So if I am, so let me just do like a mark all for a number of these. So if I go to my actions, so first of all, if I start with a print individual, that means that, say I was using that Allenson Properties was my vendor. So, and I had some different amounts. So if I'm printing individually, if this one has 450 and Entity 200 has 700 and Entity 300 has $600 for that, or $650 for that vendor. So I would not get a 1099 for Entity 100 because it was only $450, which is under the 600 threshold. I would get it for Allenson Properties for 200 and 300. So we do look at it individually. Now, if we consolidate, so if we added those three together and said they're going to be one 1099, we add up the 450, the 750, and the 650. I think those were the three numbers I used. We add those up together, whatever that total is, that's obviously greater than 600, so we will print a 1099. So we consolidate first and then check it against the minimum amount.
Okay, and I think we have another one here. I think this is our last one. Megan asked, we are a centralized AP with multiple parent-child entities. We have different individuals working in each parent-child relationship. Can more than one person be working on 1099s for their parent-child at the same time?
I believe so. I don't think there's a limitation on people accessing this print 1099 window. If they're actually running the print process, definitely doing any of the editing or checking, there should be no problem with that. But yeah, no, I don't believe there's any lockdown on the, because basically all we're doing is printing reports. So we'll be pulling the same information if they happen to select the same entity. But if they're printing different entities, then definitely there shouldn't be a problem.
Great, we do have another one that just popped up, so we'll get that one out too. Pat Taylor asked, if I change a vendor tax type through utilities/update 1099 information from interest to miscellaneous and rerun the smart list, the type does not change on the smart list. Is there a different field that I need to choose for this updated information on the smart list?
So I'm not 100% sure what smart list you are looking at, only because, and the reason why I'm mentioning that is I'm just going to pull it up here. The multi-entity, unless we added it, nope, we didn't. The tax is not on our native smart list. So I have a feeling that might have been either one that has been built by you or your VAR, and I'm not sure where it's pulling that information from. One thing to check, go back and check, is it updated on when you go into the entity and the vendor, is it showing under the corrected box under here? So just double check that, and if you have any issues with that, let our support know.
And I think that's everything in terms of the questions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending, or those of you listening on the recording. So I have my information set up there. So if you have any further questions pertaining to this particular webinar, do go ahead and email me. And then Maria, I think you have some, like you're going to send out the recording.
Yes, definitely. We will follow up with an email tonight or tomorrow morning with the recording attached and the presentation as well.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and good luck with your 1099s.